What $1 was worth the year you were born? Reach in your pocket right now and pull out a single dollar. Look at it for a second. In today's world, that dollar barely buys you anything. Maybe half a candy bar. Maybe a few minutes of parking. It's become almost a joke of a unit, something so small we barely notice when it slips out of our hands. But here's the thing. That same dollar, at different points in history, was an entirely different object. Not just in terms of what it could buy, but in terms of what it represented, how hard someone had to work to earn it, and what kind of life it could quietly support. So today, we're going to trace that single dollar bill backward through time, decade by decade, and see just how dramatically its power has shifted. And somewhere along the way, you might just find the year you were born and get a real sense of what your very first dollar would have actually meant. Let's start as far back as this comparison can meaningfully go. 1913, the year the United States created the Federal Reserve, and effectively the starting point most economists use as the baseline for tracking modern inflation. In 1913, $1 had the purchasing power of roughly $32 in today's money. Think about what that actually meant in daily life. A dollar could buy you about 4 gallons of milk, or a substantial sack of flour that could feed a family for weeks or cover several nights at a modest hotel. The average American worker at the time earned somewhere around 22 cents an hour. So earning that single dollar meant working nearly a full workday. Let's jump forward to the 1920s, a decade often remembered for glittering excess, though that excess was concentrated in a fairly narrow slice of society. By 1925, a dollar was worth roughly $18 in today's terms. You could still buy a decent meal at a diner with $1 and get change back. A movie ticket cost around 15 cents, meaning a single dollar could get you into the theater several times over. This was also the decade when consumer credit started becoming widespread, letting ordinary families buy radios, cars, and appliances they couldn't previously afford outright. Then comes the 1930s, and the picture shifts dramatically, not because the dollar suddenly became weaker, but because of the opposite. The Great Depression brought severe deflation in many sectors, even as unemployment devastated household incomes. By 1935, a dollar carried the purchasing power of about $22 today. Prices on many goods had actually fallen. The tragedy wasn't that the dollar was worth less. It was that millions of people simply didn't have dollars to spend at all. Moving into the 1940s, the world was reshaped by war, and the dollar story reflects that. By 1945, as World War II came to a close, a dollar held the purchasing power of roughly $17 today. Wartime price controls had kept inflation somewhat in check domestically, even as the government poured unprecedented resources into the war effort. A loaf of bread cost around 9 cents. A gallon of gasoline was about 15 cents, though gasoline itself was tightly rationed for much of the war. The 1950s bring us into the post-war boom, a period many people picture when they imagine simpler, more affordable times. By 1955, a dollar was worth about $11 in today's money. A dozen eggs cost around 60 cents. A new car, on average, cost less than $2,000, which sounds almost fictional today, though it's worth remembering that average wages were also dramatically lower, hovering around $2 an hour for many workers. The 1960s carried this relative stability forward for a while, but by the end of the decade, the cracks were starting to show. By 1969, a dollar held the purchasing power of about $8 today. A movie ticket had climbed to around $1.50. Gas was about 35 cents a gallon. This was also the decade when a college education, while not free, remained genuinely affordable for a middle-class family without requiring decades of debt afterward, a detail that stands in sharp contrast to where things would eventually head. Then we hit the 1970s, and this is where the story of the dollar takes its sharpest, most dramatic turn in the entire 20th century. Oil price shocks, the end of the gold standard, and a wage price spiral combined to produce a decade of runaway inflation unlike anything America had experienced in generations. By 1979, A dollar that had been worth $8 just a decade earlier was now worth only about $4 in today's terms. Prices for everyday goods, gasoline, groceries, housing climbed at a pace that genuinely shocked people who had grown up believing prices simply didn't move that fast. A gallon of gas that cost 35 cents in 1969 was pushing past $1 by the end of the 1970s. The early 1980s continued to feel this pressure, with interest rates climbing to levels that seem almost unbelievable today, sometimes exceeding 18% on home mortgages, as the Federal Reserve fought aggressively to finally break the back of inflation. By 1985, a dollar held roughly the purchasing power of about $2.80 today. It's around this point in our timeline that the dollar's purchasing power starts settling into something closer to what feels intuitively familiar to anyone alive today. The 1990s brought a period of relative stability. By 1995, a dollar was worth about $2 in today's money. A gallon of milk cost around $2.50. A movie ticket was climbing toward $5. This was also the decade the internet began entering ordinary households, quietly setting the stage for economic shifts that wouldn't fully reveal themselves for another decade or two. By the early 2000s, the dollar's purchasing power was continuing its steady, gradual decline, but at a much gentler pace than the chaos of the 1970s. In 2005, a dollar held the purchasing power of about $1.30 in today's terms. Gas hovered around $2.20 a gallon. A movie ticket was pushing toward $7. The 2010s brought us closer still to today's baseline. By 2015, a dollar was worth roughly $1.10 in today's money, a relatively modest gap that reflects a period of historically low inflation across much of the developed world, following the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And then we arrive at the past few years, where something genuinely notable happened. After decades of relatively gentle, predictable inflation, the years following 2020 brought a sharp, rapid resurgence, driven by a combination of pandemic-related supply disruptions, unprecedented government spending, and shifting global energy markets. Between 2021 and 2023 alone, the dollar lost a meaningfully larger chunk of its purchasing power than it had in almost any comparable short stretch since the 1970s, a genuine reminder that the story of inflation isn't just a relic of history textbooks. It's still actively being written. So stepping back from all of these individual decades, what does this entire journey actually tell us? The most obvious takeaway is the simplest one. A dollar today buys dramatically less than it did even a few decades ago, let alone a century ago. But the more interesting takeaway sits just beneath that surface. The rate at which the dollar lost its value wasn't steady or predictable. It moved in dramatic bursts, the 1970s being the most extreme example in modern American history, followed by long stretches of relative calm. This tells us something important. Inflation isn't some constant, background hum that hums along at the exact same volume every year. It's episodic. It surges during specific crises, wars, oil shocks, pandemics, and then settles back into quieter periods that can last for years, sometimes decades, lulling people into assuming prices will simply stay where they are. There's also a deeper, more personal layer to all of this. The specific year you were born essentially set the starting exchange rate for your entire relationship with money. If you were born in the 1950s, your early sense of what things should cost was calibrated against a dollar worth roughly 11 times what it's worth today. If you were born in the 2000s, your baseline sense of value formed in a dollar that had already lost the vast majority of the purchasing power it once held. Neither experience is more real than the other. They're just different starting points on the exact same long, uneven curve. And maybe that's the real value in an exercise like this. It's easy to complain, understandably, that everything feels more expensive than it used to. But actually tracing the dollar's journey year by year, decade by decade, shows you that this isn't some sudden, recent betrayal. It's the continuation of a pattern that's been running, with occasional dramatic accelerations for well over a century now. The dollar in your pocket today isn't broken. It's simply the latest chapter in a story that's been unfolding since long before any of us were born, and one that, if history is any guide, is very much still being written.